Since the battery rebate was announced last year, we've installed hundreds of battery systems, and often we run into trouble finding a good location to put these systems.
Yeah, so over the last 6 months, the team and I have gone and developed this battery installation location guide. We've read the standards, we've read the install manuals, and we've really covered the practical tips that our installers are finding while they're out on site too. In this video, we're going to take you through our guide.
So before we jump into our battery locations guide, first we want to say that lithium iron phosphate batteries, which is what we find in pretty much all home storage systems today, are inherently very safe. And in some ways, some of these regulations are quite overkill.
Yeah, right. But my Sparkies don't care about what your opinion is of whether they're overkill or not. Whether they're overkill or not, our installers have to keep these guidelines. Otherwise, they just can lose demerit points. So standards are there to be kept. Some of these standards you hear are kind of funny and contradictory in ways anyway. We still just have to interpret them the best way we can and keep them the best way they can, even though they may not be completely logical.
Yeah, so long story short, what we're really trying to do is find a location that we can safely install that battery that were it to catch on fire, it would not burn into a room where somebody may be sleeping or living or pushing hot gases, for example, into that room.
Yeah, exactly. So 101 of this is you don't want a battery in a bedroom. But habitable rooms are a lot more than that, Yorick. And in the standards, you got that list there?
I do here. So look, basically a habitable room is a room associated with a domestic or residential electrical installation used for normal living activities. And for example, a bedroom, a living room, a lounge room, a music room, television room, kitchen, sewing room, basically anything where you may be spending a large portion of your time or sleeping, it would be considered a habitable location.
And I went to the building and construction code for a definition of what is not a habitable room or non-habitable. So it excludes bathrooms, laundries, water closets, toilets, pantry, walk-in wardrobe, which I found is interesting because that's handy for me at my place, a corridor, a hallway, a lobby, a photographic darkroom, clothes drying room, and any other spaces of a specialised nature occupied neither frequently or for extended periods.
Yeah. You know what I've realised that they're missing is garages. Garages are non-habitable.
Yeah, and as it turns out, we've got that in our Australian standards. So this is crossing different standards at the same time. You know, we can refer to both.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So I guess first things first, we've ruled out habitable areas, which is basically everything in pink on the first page of our location guidelines document.
You can't install it in there. So let's go outside and maybe we'll just work from left to right on the first page, right?
Sounds like a plan.
And the first thing we've got there is a pool. So what you'll find straight out of the gate, a really quirky situation is I'm not going to install a battery in a pool.
No.
I'm going to install it by the edge of the water. Australian standards AS3000, just our wiring guide, not the battery standard, says you can't install it within 3.5 metres of the water's edge.
Yeah, but you can actually, if you do have a very large pool area with a large in-fenced pool, you can actually have it within that pool fencing area.
Yeah, so I've got quite a big pool fence area, so I'm bolting my battery to the glass fence.
No.
No, you wouldn't do that. So that's because you can, doesn't mean you should, right?
Yeah, I don't think a pool area is necessarily the best location because there's a lot of, water gets splashed around and, there could be other problems as well. But technically it is compliant as long as it's less than 3.5 metres from the water's edge.
Yeah, and if 3.5 metres means on the other side of the fence, you can't install it there as well. So, okay, so let's move on.
Actually, let's just clarify it. Just because I think that's a really key point. If it's outside of the fence, but it's still within 3.5 metres of that water, you still can't install it within that area.
Unless your fence is 6 foot.
Okay.
Or 2 metres, I think. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Might be 1.8. Whatever. Okay, let's move on to the garage, Yorick, because that's probably the most obvious place that we install batteries.
Yeah, I think garages are usually the best place. It's usually well protected from the weather. It's usually a cooler location than outside. But and it's obviously a non-habitable area.
But outside of the garage is a really common place too, because that's where your switchboard is. So outside of the garage, let's say I've got a timber house, a timber garage, and I put that battery outside of there.
Correct.
If that battery catches on fire, it'll burn down the timber wall. Can we install it there?
It can, because the garage is a non-habitable area. You don't need to have a fire sheeting layer or fireproofing layer between the battery and that non-habitable room.
Okay, so we can install it there. Now can I throw a curveball? What if we turned that garage into the teenage son's bedroom?
Then you cannot, because then it becomes a habitable room. Either it becomes a living room or it becomes a bedroom. And we do see that on occasion.
Yeah, that's a weird one because I guess it's kind of open to interpretation. But I would say no. I think my installers would go, nah, there's a bed there. We're not we're calling that a bedroom just because it's got a garage.
There's a TV in there. As I said, anything where you would be spending a significant amount of time or be sleeping in, I'd say that's a habitable room.
Okay, so let's just put it back to a garage where your cars are parking and go inside. So we can install it basically anywhere inside the garage.
You can put it anywhere within the garage. Now, what you'll see along the garage wall in this document is a green line. Now, if it is backing onto a non-habitable area, you don't have to have fire sheeting. But if it backs onto a habitable room, like a kitchen, you do need fire sheeting behind that battery.
Yeah, okay. So in this case, we haven't got that in the garage. But if you move back over to the pool, so the green line means no fire sheeting. So if it's timber house, you don't need to put any fibro there or anything. But let's say you had an orange line there because it was backing onto the kitchen. That would mean it has to have fireproofing. So does that mean necessarily that we have to put fibro on the wall? The answer is no. Trick question.
Okay.
It's because if it was a brick wall.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to trick you there. But basically that has to be fireproof material. So if you can look at the notes on the top there, it says fireproofing includes brick or masonry block, concrete, ceramic, terracotta tiles, or compressed cement sheeting, which is just fibro. Fibro. So basically, if it's a brick house, we don't have to put fibro there, obviously. It's already fireproof. But if it's a timber house or something like that, you're just going to get that 6mm fibro and screw it to the wall.
Yeah, let's talk about that on the next page.
Okay,
when we get to that point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spoken a bit about the garage. The other, I guess, common thing is if you have a multi-story house. So if you have a habitable room above that battery, you may need fire sheeting, even if it is a non-habitable space.
And we're going to get to all those tricky sort of nuances in the next page as well.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so look, we've let's move on to, say, a bathroom. Now, this is in bright red highlighting. We can't install it in a bathroom.
Yeah, no, you can't install it anywhere near such a big water basin, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in a laundry, that's much a smaller water basin, or, with a shower head and everything. So basically, bathrooms are ruled out. Who's going to install a battery in a bathroom anyway?
No, not me. But yeah, even though it's a non-habitable space, bathrooms are a no-go.
That's right. If you go to the left of that, we've got stairwells. Do you know what, Yorick? You can install a battery in a stairwell.
You can install it in a stairwell, but not under a stairwell.
Not under a stairwell. And if you've got a stairwell, as you can see in this picture, backing onto your garage or outside of the house or whatever it is, you can install it back to back. So even if it catches on fire to that wall, it'll burn through your stairs. You could actually have it in the stairwell burning down, but you just can't put it below it. Doesn't totally make sense, except it sort of does that fire goes up.
Yeah.
It's always burning up. So whether it makes sense or not, you can install it in a stairwell. If you've got some crazy stairwell that happens to have a big landing and it doesn't look ugly there, I guess we can. We probably wouldn't.
I guess this is where some of the duality of the regulations come into play. It's a nonsensical location, but technically we can put it.
Yeah.
But you should not.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Haven't seen every stairwell in Australia. There might be some stairwells that it makes sense to put it there.
Okay. Well, let's go to the other side of the bathroom then. What about a hallway? So hallways are also a non-habitable area.
So we can install it in a hallway as long, and you can see that little note that we've put there, is as long as you have 1 meter of safe egress or passageway. So if your hallway is 1.2 meters wide and your battery is 100mm wide, you can still pass that with a meter space. You can put it in the hallway. Again, I don't think there's too many people that are going to install their battery in a hallway, but technically you can.
Yeah, it's an interesting location. Now, I guess probably the one with the most nuance is a storage room. So what is classified as a storage room? That is actually quite a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you look at what we said before, what is a habitable room and what excludes a habitable room, you can kind of work it out from there, as long as it's not one of those, but something that is designed. I wouldn't say a third bedroom that you're using as storage room.
Yeah.
It's a bedroom. And this, I think, really does come down to the installer's interpretation of the standard. It's their license on the line, so it's a little bit hard to argue with them and tell them where to put it when they're the one that can get pinged.
Yeah.
I would say a storage room is relatively obviously a smaller room that you can store stuff in. You know,
Yeah,
so.
but you wouldn't be fitting a bed in it, or you wouldn't be doing your sewing in it, or something where, it is dedicated as a storage area and nothing else.
Yeah. I was going to say under the stairs is a good storage room, but you can't put it there because that's under the stairs. So
Yeah. So look, I think a good example of a storage room would be there's been some garages where we've seen where there might be a dog leg where it sort of sticks out around a corner, and look, that is quite obviously an area designed specifically for storage.
yeah, okay. Now let's get out onto the veranda. So we're fine to install a battery pretty much anywhere on a veranda, as long as you're not backing on. Well, if you're backing onto a habitable room, again, you need the fireproofing there. But
That's correct.
verandas are fine and dandy. Now this is the trickiest, probably one of this page, Yorick, is that dotted line, which if you look up on the legend, you cannot install under access walkways is the way the standard says it.
And that is quite a tricky one because, is a hallway classified as an access way? Or is it only like a elevated bridge, for example?
So this is where I want to call in a friend. If anyone listening, I've looked as much as I can, asked ChatGPT, keep on getting different answers to this, looked at the building code. Okay, it's actually been a few weeks since Yorick and I recorded this video, and I've spent a lot of time updating this standard and putting it onto a web page where it's really interactive, and I've got the clauses backing up what I'm saying. And in the process of doing that, I found a few errors on this. And one is the clarification about access walkways. Now, this is quite controversial because inspectors in New South Wales and Victoria disagree with me, and inspector friends that I know on this point. But I think it's rock solid. So is the path from your back door to your stairway on a high-set house, that veranda section, is that an access walkway? I say it is no, and this is the reason why. So let's say you open your back door, you step out onto the veranda in that 600 mil radius where you're not allowed to put a battery in that area. Well, if you look below that 600 mil radius underneath your veranda, as long as you are 900 mil below that, you can install a battery there. That means, therefore, that area is not an access walkway. And if that area straight outside your back door is not an access walkway on your veranda, then why is the path to your stairs an access walkway? So I think the term access walkway is something to do with a commercial property, a path between two buildings, maybe for personnel access or something like that. I think that is rock solid. If you disagree with me, put it down in the comments. But if you want to look more into the justification for all of this standard, I've got a much fuller, I've built this out into like a 8-page web page sort of thing. Check out the link up above, and that'll bring you to my full guide with my rationale and the clauses behind it. On with the video. Is a walkway somewhere between my bedroom and the coffee machine in the morning?
Well, it is in the morning.
It's an emergency path for me, but I think that could be classified as a walkway, but obviously that's not what they're getting at.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people could argue that a walkway is not a hallway. A walkway is sort of something between two buildings where they've got an elevated walkway or something like that.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's also, look, we need to be clear, leave entranceways and like emergency escape routes free. So I would also classify a walkway as basically the direct route to leave the primary residence.
Yeah. Emergency exit actually is in there, but it has to be defined as an emergency exit. It's in my office.
Yeah.
I've got an emergency exit evacuation route. That's an emergency exit. You don't have those at home, so that actually doesn't count. But talking of doorways, you can see the note in the garage, in the doorway to the garage, that we have to be a 600 mil radius from any doorway if the doorway is less than 900 mil wide.
And that's really interesting because at first that wasn't very clearly defined. And so we thought you had to be 600 away from any door, any entranceway.
Originally it did. They've updated the standards. Yeah.
Okay. And this is why we're doing an updated video. So essentially, so if you've got a big roller door, which is more than a meter wide or a couple of meters wide, you can have the battery right up near the roller door. But if you've got let's say you've got a door that's exactly 901 millimeters wide.
Yeah. Okay. So the standards make this actually pretty clear now, which is kind of good, is that if it's 901 millimeters wide, so this is the left side of your doorway, right side of your doorway, your battery has to be a meter away from the left side of the doorway, if you can sort of picture that. We'll put it, I reckon the standards up to show that.
And maybe even a little diagram to really make it clear. But if your door was, say, 1 meter and 1 millimeter wide, you could be right up against the door jamb.
Yeah, exactly. So as long as there's a 1 meter gap away from you and the one side of the doorway. So, yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered...
I think there was one other catch, I think, in this document that may not be on the front page, and that's a battery room mark.
Yes, okay. So a battery room, that's an interesting one because we used to consider, like, let's say you've got a storage room, some kind of weird storage room at the back that you put a battery in and the only thing you're using it for is a battery, really, in reality. I would have called that a battery room, and then the standards have really stupid requirements where you need to stay like 900 away from the side, and it's basically impossible to make that in a battery room. The standards have clarified that with the update, that a battery room is basically if you go to a government building and they've got a room that was designed and installed as a battery room where they've got a massive lot of batteries, a plant room, something like that.
Yeah.
That's now what a battery room is, not a storage room that you whack a battery in. That's not a battery room.
Okay. So if it's like a linen closet and you put a battery in it, it is still a linen closet.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate online, and I was tripped up first with the standards. There's a section that I might put up here that talks about how you have to be, I can't remember, 900 mil away from the side and all that sort of thing. That is for battery rooms, which we're not dealing with almost ever.
All right, so we've spoken about all the locations where you're actually allowed to put the battery. Now, what we're going to go into next is what are the requirements if it's backing onto a habitable room and you need to fire sheet?
Yeah, so Yorick, when you do have to fire sheet, let's say you've got a timber wall, there's a bedroom on the other side, there are a lot of requirements around that. But the first is how big do you need that fire sheeting? In short, you need it 600 mil to the left, 600 mil to the right, and 900 mil above.
And behind the battery too, don't forget that.
And behind the battery as well, yeah, of course. So, of course, it's further above because where do fires go? They go up.
Yeah.
And if you notice this particular image that I've got here, we've put a Tesla Powerwall on there.
Why is that?
Most batteries can't be installed or hung on the wall.
Okay.
Tesla Powerwall can. So you don't actually have to fire sheet below the battery, which actually makes sense because when you think about it, fires go up, they'll go up 900 mil easily, but they're not really going to burn below the battery, so you don't have to fire sheet that. So you probably would anyway, just for aesthetics, fire sheet the whole lot, but there it is.
Well, okay, so we've got this big sheet. It's very hard to get that in my back of my car and take it home from Bunnings. How am I going to can I do it in 2 sheets?
Yeah, you can. So you can have, we've got in that fibro area, you've got a 5 mil gap. So you can have a 5 mil join in the fibro. Any bigger than that, then you start using fire sealant or anything like that.
Okay.
So,
And how do I fix this fire sheeting to the wall? Do I have to glue it on because I can't have any holes?
Yeah, no. Well, if you screw it with a screw that's less than a 5 mil shank, then you don't have a 5 mil hole in it. So, so you're fine to screw that to the wall.
Yeah.
No problems there.
These are just very common questions.
Here's a top tip though, Eric. Don't get Sparkies to do chippy work. Or don't get chippies to do Sparky work either, right? So we recommend a builder normally to do this work unless the customer wants to do it themselves because we're not chippies.
Yeah. And look, and it's not a difficult thing to do. It's just about making sure you have the right equipment. So we mentioned earlier in the video that it had to be a minimum of 6 millimeter thick compressed cement sheeting or fibro sheeting. Yep. So, but you can use a thicker sheeting if that makes you more comfortable as well. It wouldn't make it non-compliant if it was
that's
8 or
right.
10 mil.
Just got that minimum, and 6 mil is your standard sheet of fibro that you pick up at Bunnings.
That's correct.
Okay, let's go to the left side here. So down the left on the bottom, we say that you need to have clearance from appliances.
Okay.
That's been misinterpreted many times. An appliance is the 2 main ones. You'd think of it as an aircon, or a hot water system, or maybe a pump for a tank.
Yep, that's very common.
Or something like that.
Yep.
So they're appliances. A PowerPoint is not an appliance. They've clarified that. It's so you can have a PowerPoint in there. It does get tricky though if you have that PowerPoint penetrating through the fibro, and pulling out, but you can't have a 5 mil gap. So there's probably a way of doing it with having fire sealing there. At this stage, you have to have a builder there at the same time as a Sparky. So the way that we've got it here is that you're just conduiting in if you want it up out.
If you really, really needed to do it, yep. Okay. And lights are also included in that as well. So as lights are light, it's not an appliance.
It's not an appliance, yeah. So they do differentiate. Now, if you go over to the right-hand side of this wall, that B&R meter box is just the name for your standard meter box. B&R is a major brand for it.
Yep.
And so your big meter box, these are not fire-rated material. So even though that is made from, I think, 1 mil sheet metal, that's not thick enough to be considered fire-rated.
So if my meter box is, say, on the side of my lounge room or my bedroom, and I have my battery right next to it, I have to be at least 60 centimeters or 600 mil from that meter box.
Well, no.
Okay.
You could take that meter box out off, fire sheet behind it, and put it back on. Realistically, you're not going to do that.
No.
And then your penetrations in the wall for your cables to come out, so it's not realistic. So in reality, even though a meter box is not an appliance and it can be in that area,
okay,
it needs fire sheeting. If you don't need to have fire sheeting, your meter box is fine to be within that area.
So if it's my meter box is on the side of the garage and my battery's right next to the meter box on the side of the garage, I can be within that 600 mil.
And so, and this is where it gets really confusing. So this image, see the pink wall behind?
Yeah.
That is talking about a habitable room behind. The garage is not a habitable room. So in most situations, your meter box, or quite often, your meter box is on next to the garage. Meter box is not an appliance. Whack your battery right next to it. No worries.
Okay.
So
wonderful. All right, well, what if I've got my battery inside the garage, right? And it's not next to the meter box, it's inside the garage, but it's a multi-story house. So I've got a bedroom above.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what do I need to do then?
Yeah, so we haven't covered this yet. So if you are close to the ceiling, so this then gets pretty tricky, and you're going to have to spend a little bit of time looking at these images. I don't think we're going to be able to verbally communicate this, but it really depends on whether the other side of the wall is habitable and the room above is habitable. And so if you've got a different combination of this is habitable, but that's not habitable, or this is, the other way around, it's going to be more confusing. So as you can see there, the pink is habitable. We've written hab there because I even find this confusing to read myself.
Yes.
So to explain that maybe better is that we don't measure 600 mil from here, from the wall out, and put fibro on the ceiling there. We measure 600 mil from the front of the battery out, and from this side of the battery out. So you've got quite a big piece of fibro up on the ceiling in that case.
That's correct.
And remembering now, you might need to be cutting out your cornice and stuff like that. So it can get quite unsightly, especially if you get a Sparky to do it.
Okay, but then look, let's say the room behind the battery is non-habitable. Well, I don't need fire sheeting in that case, but the bedroom...
Which image are you talking about now?
Okay, so let's move up to the top right
image.
Okay, so the room behind the battery is non-habitable, but the room above is. It is an interesting one because if the room behind is non-habitable, you don't have to fire sheet. It's only if the roof or the room above is less than 90 centimeters from the top of the battery do you have to fire sheet above.
Yeah.
So it's a really bit of a interesting conclusion to that.
Yeah, a bit of a strange nuance. And battery standards are really hard things to write, right? They can't cover everything and make it perfectly logical. So it's so easy to have a crack at the guys that wrote these standards.
Yeah.
But, this is like version 12 of version 2 of the battery standards, and I still have errors on it.
Yeah.
Right. And they're trying to write hundreds of pages. This is the standards we've got to work with. And it does kind of make sense. If you sit there and examine it and think about it, it does make some kind of logical sense.
I agree. And I guess what it comes down to is if there's a habitable room above or habitable room behind, you may need a fire sheet either way.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say you're in your garage, non-habitable room, and there is a non-habitable room above, which, I don't know, it might be a storage room or something like that, or a veranda, then no fire sheeting required.
Not required, yes.
So,
but you might still want to do it because it gives you peace of mind.
Yep. We put there that you need 150 mil just so you can, for ease of installation, and normally you need clearance around batteries just for cooling as well. So
that's correct, yeah. So at that point, you should consult your battery installation guidelines from the manufacturer to get those clearances.
Yep, sure. Okay, so that's most of inside dealt with, Yorick. Let's move outside.
Okay, so what we're going to get into now is some of the more nuanced requirements when it comes to fire sheeting. Bear with us here, this is going to get a little bit tricky, but let's start off with under the heading close to habitable on page 3. So we know that if the battery is backing onto a non-habitable room like a garage, we don't have to fire sheet that wall. But if it is backing onto a habitable area, let's say on the left here, which might be a bedroom, we need to have that fire sheeting extend 60 centimeters or 90 centimeters above.
But what if the battery is doing both?
Well, this is where things are a bit, and I find this very, very interesting. So if the battery is within 60 centimeters of that habitable room, you need to fire sheet within that clearance on that habitable area. So you could have a battery sitting on a wall and then a little thin strip of cement fibro.
How good would that look, Yorick?
Awful. Yeah. So you wouldn't do that. You would just fire sheet that whole strip.
Fire sheet the whole lot for looks. I mean, maybe, especially if it was an afterthought. That's pretty easy in this situation.
Yeah.
But now that on the right-hand side of that house, what's that orange line around? That's not fire sheeting?
No, that is the clearances that are required.
So that's a bit of a tricky one. So getting back to that previous page where I said that you can't install an aircon in that area, but you can install a meter box in that area. If it is not a fire-rated area. So, whether you can install an appliance in that area is basically the reason for that orange line.
We'll get into that a bit more in just a sec. I wanted to cover the external corners because we're still on the fire sheeting nuances.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So if we go down the left-hand side of the right-hand side of that page, and we talk about external corners. So I can put my battery right on the edge of the corner, and if it's a habitable area, I need to extend that fire sheeting around the bend 60 centimeters beyond that battery. But what if I'm getting close? What if I'm only 200 mil away from that corner?
Yeah. So first one, is if you're right on that wall, basically the battery is on that side wall. They're considering it, for purposes. So you need 600 mil past it. But if you're 200 mil away from the wall, you just do some maths and you add 200 and 400, and so that way you've got 600 mil of fire sheeting all up.
Yeah.
Pretty arbitrary, but that's what the rules are, right?
Okay. But if I am 301 millimeters away from that corner, now I don't have to bend around the bend.
People get really tripped up on this question here, is why would you not go 300 plus another 300?
Yeah.
This rule comes in because what they say, some installers do this, I think it's ridiculous. The rule is if you are 300 mil away from a wall, so pull your battery 300 mil out.
L bracket in, yeah.
Put a big bracket in. If you're 300 mil away from that wall, you don't need fire sheeting. So some people are just coming 300 mil out from the house, whacking the battery in the middle of the carport or something like that, and saying you don't have to fire sheet that, which I guess you can do. In most situations, that would be really ugly.
Yeah.
But that's where this rule applies, is that if you're 300 mil away from that side wall, effectively it's the same as bringing it 300 mil out from a wall. Now that other wall doesn't have to be fire sheeted. So kind of crazy, but that's how we have to interpret the rules as they're sort of written.
Yeah, I guess this is really where some of the nuances come in. But again, these are sort of the more unusual places where you would put a battery. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we spoke very briefly earlier about that orange line around the battery that extends 60 centimeters either side and 90 centimeters above. And this
you can't put appliances.
We can't put appliances, but you also can't have doors, windows into habitable rooms, or vents into a habitable room.
Yeah, okay. So that first image there is saying it doesn't matter basically whether it's fire rated, it's habitable or non-habitable. You've got to stay 600 mil away from the door.
Yeah,
from the opening of the door.
Unless it opens more than 900 millimeters.
Unless it opens more than 900 millimeters, and then we've got that 1 meter egress idea that we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Okay. But if it is a habitable room, you have to fire sheet, and you can't fire sheet over glass or fire sheet over the entranceway or doorway.
But Yorick, aluminium and glass, that's not going to burn.
Look, but it's not fire rated. It does not meet the standards for that fire safety requirement.
As it turns out, you can get fire rated glass. Apparently down in Victorian fire zones, they've got fire rated glass. So as long as that aluminium, I guess, and the whole window is fire rated, then technically that would be allowed.
Yeah.
But aluminium windows aren't, most windows aren't fire rated.
Yeah. And if you knew for a fact that it was fire rated, you'd really want to be able to show that to both the installer as well as any inspector that might come around so that they could go, yes, they did their due diligence.
Yeah. Okay. And so you can't have a vent into that room.
But look, things that I would consider vents are like extractor vents into a bathroom or extractor vent into a kitchen. So if it's venting into a bathroom, then that's a non-issue. That's non-habitable.
What about a window into a bathroom?
Also non-issue.
Yep. Okay.
It's a non-habitable room.
So that is the habitable, non-habitable issue again.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've covered all those kind of outside of the house requirements.
Okay, so before we wrap up this video on battery installation locations, Mark, how do people find this document we've been talking about?
Hey, Yorick, give me a break. This has taken me so long to do this. I feel like I've finished a massive assignment. But I'm going to get back into blogging. I'm going to put this in a blog format, and I'll link the PDF to it as well. So if you just jump on my MC Electrical, look at my blog page. I haven't done a blog for quite a while. But I'll get around to it maybe a couple of weeks after we post this and link the PDF. Hopefully it's handy for you, for installers. In the meantime, before I do that, actually, if you can give feedback in the comments over the next couple of weeks, we might change our mind on some of this, and fix up some of the little mistakes that I've noticed as well.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's get into internal corners. So this may be inside or outside, but this is specifically when you're trying to put a battery on an inside edge of a corner. So like inside of the 90 degrees.
So that could be like the back corner of your garage.
Yeah.
Or it could be outside if you had this sort of weird dog leg on the outside of your house. Yeah.
That's correct. And so, look, you were saying that there was you were telling me privately that there's been a lot of debate on the Solar Cutters pages is exactly what the clearances are here.
Yeah, I have seen that in the past, and I kind of got tripped up in it myself. And then when I started looking into this, I'm like, it's actually clear as day in the standards.
Okay.
So this 600 mil clearance from a battery, you can't measure 300 mil along the wall and then 300 mil along the wall.
But this is a radius.
It's the 600 mil radius from an appliance. An appliance is an air conditioner, a hot water system, not
like a light or a power
point.
Well, here you go.
Or a switchboard.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I might give you a quick question. What about if a customer's got a modem or a router in their garage?
No, mate, can't put a battery there.
Okay. Well, we'll just move the battery, or we'll move the router. It's an easy fix.
You're the ideas man.
Okay. Yeah. All right. But okay. So we know we have to be 600 mil away from an appliance. That's an absolute given. But what if I want to tuck the battery really close to that wall? I need to be at least, if it's more than 300 mil from that wall, I don't need to fire sheet around in through that bend, do I?
If it's more than 300 mil, yes, that's right. So, and that top image there, and the reason for that, you would kind of think you'd have to make up that 600, but going back to that previous page, it's the same idea as if you put a battery in a garage, let's say, or an external wall that you need to fire sheet, just pull that battery 300 mil away from the wall, and you don't have to fire sheet it. Some turkeys do that.
Yeah.
I think it's a terrible idea in most situations.
I agree. Yeah.
But you can get away with it. But this is applying that logic, saying if you're 300 mil away from that adjacent wall, then they're saying the fire is not going to spread.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's totally logical, but that's what the rules are.
Yeah. So I guess it's one of those things where, look, the standards say you don't have to fire sheet, but you could still do so if it gave you peace of mind. But what if it was a really tight nook? Let's say it's almost like a walk-in wardrobe sized nook, and I had less than 300 from that corner.
Yeah. So as soon as you get closer than 300 mil, you've broken that 300 mil away from the wall rule.
Okay.
Then you have to just add up to 600. And that's where people get it mixed up with appliances. But for fire sheeting, you just have to add up to 600 rather than the 600 radius.
Okay. Right? All right. And then what if it was a really, really tight nook and I could just squeeze the battery?
And we get this all the time where we're trying to maximize that little space and there's a window here in the corner there or something like that.
Yep.
Basically, you just need to have enough access to work on the cable side of the battery. So where the cables go into the battery, depends which battery you're using. You need to normally be, we call it 150 mil. You might have to get a stubby screwdriver to work in there, but that's sort of enough to do your job. But that kind of really depends on the battery. Some batteries, installation manuals might say you need more clearance.
Yeah.
And we've put a bunch of different information down there for our batteries, because this was originally done for our installers.
Yep.
That if you've got a Tesla Powerwall, 2 Tesla Powerwalls, we want 200 because you can't plug those plugs in beside the Powerwall and the expansion pack.
Or what if I had 2 stacks of the BYD? I want about a foot between the two of them at minimum?
Yeah, or minimum 200, but then you need some wall space so that you can put your isolators, so your combiner box where both batteries join into. And if you've got 3 stacks, we even use a larger combiner box. So there's kind of these nuances around that, even though the rules say that you might be able to have something like 150 mil gap, you've got to think of all the other things that you're going to put in that space as well.
And your installer really should consult their installation manual for their battery as well, because this will be very brand specific as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can trip you up. I think we have been tripped up in the early days where we didn't have all this as clear, and then the installer goes, where am I going to go put the the combiner box, you know. So, Yorick.
Yeah, I guess we've learned the hard way, and this is why we're trying to pass on our knowledge. Well, so I guess at the end of the day, this video has really been for the installer or for the customer, where they're either wanting to fire sheet themselves or whether they want to choose a good battery location before their consultant comes out. And hopefully this will act as a guide so you know exactly what's needed, how much fire sheet is involved, and how to do it properly. And look, if there's any comments or mistakes that we've made.
I'm not fallible, so it would be good. Don't treat
Speak for yourself. I'm infallible, Mark.
Don't treat this as the standards. This is my interpretation of the standards. I'd love it if guys could give me feedback. If you've got my mobile, give me a buzz, or give us comments below, because it is a bit of a work in progress. I think we're pretty well tight.
Yeah,
and we'll make sure we clean this all up before I get it into that blog format.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.